The park was coming alive in the morning sun, its paths filled with joggers, cyclists, and people strolling leisurely with coffee in hand. A boy of about 15 appeared on one of the side alleys, rolling slowly in his old wheelchair. His movements were measured but confident. A fluffy ginger cat was nestled in his lap, lazily turning his nose up to the sunlight. It was their ritual to take small walks in the park, where the world seemed a little less harsh. The teenager's name was Jamal. He knew that at first glance his life looked difficult to others. A disability after an injury and endless judgmental looks from people because of his skin color. But he had long ago learned to ignore the prejudice, focusing on his friendship with those who would never betray. His cat, Milo. Jamal didn't know that this day would be the worst day of his life. On the opposite side of the alley stood two policemen. Their uniforms shone in the sun, but their facial expressions were far from suggestive of safety. One of them, a tall man with rough features and a cold stare, pointed at Jamal. The other, with a smirk that didn't bode well, nodded back. Their gazes were like knives aimed at the teenager. Jamal sensed it at once. He sped up, trying not to meet their eyes. He knew such glances never boded well, but Milo, sensing his unease, rumbled louder, as if trying to reassure him. "Hey, boy, stop!" A rough voice broke the silence like a gunshot. Jamal froze. The cops were coming toward him, their boots thudding on the pavement. "Where are you going so fast?" One of them started, leaning closer. His face was only a few centimeters from Jamal's. "This is a decent neighborhood, you know. Did you forget something here?" "Just taking a walk," Jamal answered quietly, trying to keep his composure. But his voice trembled. "Walking?" The second policeman, with a smirk, glanced at the cat. "What kind of animal is that? A stolen cat? What do you need cats like you for? Did you find them in garbage dumps?" Jamal hugged Milo tighter, feeling the cat tense up. He didn't know what to say. Every word seemed like a potential mistake. "He doesn't say anything suspicious," said the first policeman, straightening up. "You, boy, don't think we're going to let you hang around here for nothing. We know your kind. You're probably carrying drugs in that baby carriage of yours." "No, it's just a walk, honest." Jamal looked up, but immediately regretted it. There wasn't an ounce of sympathy in their gazes, only hatred and hunger for humiliation. "Let's check it out," one of them smirked, starting to move toward his stroller. "We'll see what kind of cat he is. Maybe he's your cover." Milo hissed, sensing the threat, and Jamal realized that this day would never be forgotten. But he didn't know yet how violent it would be. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are hearing our stories from, and whether there has been a similar injustice in your life or the lives of your loved ones. We need to know your thoughts and stories. If you're interested in stories like these, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. And now we continue. Jamal gripped the wheels of his wheelchair tighter, instinctively trying to put more distance between himself and the approaching policeman. But their footsteps were quick, and in a few seconds one of them, tall and burly, loomed over him like a storm cloud. His face was stretched into a sarcastic grin. "So, kid, you're going for a ride in a strange neighborhood?" he said in a tone that sounded like he was talking to the trash on the road, not to a person. "This ain't no dump to drive wherever you want." "I'm just taking a walk," Jamal repeated quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. But his voice trembled. He could already feel it turning against him. "Walking?" The second policeman, skinny with a shaved head, squatted down to be level with his face. His eyes glistened with pleasure. "Is this your wheel protest or what? Or are you just trying to piss off normal people?" Jamal looked away. He knew that any words could only make things worse, but the silence seemed to irritate them even more. "Look at him. He's not even looking." The first one snorted, patting his comrade on the shoulder. "It's not nice to be told the truth, is it? You don't belong here, okay?" The skinny man leaned even closer so that his face was only a few centimeters from Jamal's. He smelled of coffee and cigarettes. "You know, you got a lot of nerve. I'm thinking, where'd you get that stroller? You stole it, didn't you? Guys like you're all about stealing." Jamal looked up, unable to bear it any longer. "That's my stroller. They gave it to me." But his words were met with loud laughter. "Dolly?" repeated the first, casting a glance at the stroller. "You, boy, don't get anything for free. The whole state works for people like you, and you're here in the park for a walk. I bet we pay taxes for you. And that cat." The skinny one reached for Milo, but Jamal quickly covered him with his body. "Look, aren't you a little too attached to this mutt? Is he even clean? Or are you just like him, spreading disease in the streets?" Milo hissed, arching his back. Jamal felt his hands begin to tremble. He wanted to run away, to hide, to disappear, but the stroller wouldn't give him that freedom. "Look at him," the tall one grinned. "He's sitting like a king on a throne, but the throne is iron, and he smells like a garbage can." Every word cut Jamal like a knife. He couldn't understand why these adults, whom he had regarded as symbols of law and justice since childhood, saw in him only an object for humiliation. "Listen, do you even realize where you are?" the thin man continued, tapping his finger on the handle of the stroller. "This ain't no ghetto. This is a decent place, and people like you don't fit in." "I didn't do anything wrong," Jamal finally said. He felt tears come into his eyes, but he struggled to keep them back. "Bad?" The tall policeman took a step back, waving his hands theatrically. "Your mere presence here is bad enough." Their laughter echoed through the alley, drowning out everything around them. The passers-by, noticing it, preferred to pass by with their eyes downcast. No one stopped to help. "Well, hero, let's go see what you got hidden in there," said the skinny one, suddenly grabbing the stroller by the handles. "Maybe you got drugs in there? Or maybe guns?" "Leave me alone," Jamal shouted, trying to defend himself for the first time in ages. But his voice was drowned in another wave of laughter. This was only the first act in a nightmare that would soon descend upon Jamal with full force. Jamal's screams melted into the void. The policemen weren't listening, their faces expressing something between amusement and fierce determination. The skinny one held the stroller with both hands as if it were a grocery cart, and the tall one leaned over to examine the contents. "Let's see what we have here," he said, rummaging through the bag on the back of the stroller. "I'm sure we'll find something interesting." Jamal tried to reach for his bag, but the tall policeman roughly pushed his hand away. "Hands off," he threw, adding a word Jamal had heard too often in his life not to realize its racist connotation. Milo, sensing the tension, hissed again and tried to stand up for his master, but this only made the policeman angry. "Look at him, he's a perky cat," the skinny one grinned. "He must be flea-ridden too, like his master." "He seems to think he can scare us," the tall one added, grabbing the cat by the scruff of the neck. "Leave him alone," Jamal shouted, his voice breaking with fear and anger. "Hush, boy, or we'll think you're resisting," the skinny man said with a smile, sharply pushing the stroller forward. Jamal leaned forward, nearly falling out of it. His hands gripped the armrests frantically, but the stroller kept moving. The policeman pushed it further down the alley as if enjoying the fact that there was nothing he could do. "Are you comfortable?" the tall one asked mockingly. "Probably better than your neighborhood, right?" "Stop, please," Jamal breathed out. He tried to stay calm, but his voice shook with humiliation. "Oh, look, he's begging us." The skinny man stopped and jerked the stroller sharply backward, causing its rear wheels to bounce. With that movement, there was a muffled cracking sound. Jamal knew at once that one of the fasteners on the wheelchair had broken. "Hey, look out!" the tall one shrieked theatrically. "You don't want his king's throne to fall apart." The skinny man pushed the stroller again, harder this time so that Jamal almost fell out of it. "Now you're not going anywhere," he said, watching Jamal helplessly trying to hold on to his seat. "Did they break it?" the tall one asked with feigned surprise. How embarrassing. Apparently, it was as flimsy as its owner. Jamal felt a lump of bitterness build up in his chest. His helplessness was in plain sight, and these two were taking pleasure in his misery. He could only sit in his wheelchair, which was now half broken, and watch them. "Okay, that's enough for today," the skinny man said, casting one last glance at Milo, who was still in the hands of the tall policeman. "No, I don't think we're done yet," he objected. "That cat looks suspicious. Maybe we should see what he can do." Jamal realized that this day was getting worse, but he didn't know that the worst was just beginning. Jamal's shaking hands tried to reach Milo, who was still being held by the tall policeman by the scruff of his neck. The cat wriggled frantically, its eyes full of fear, staring at its owner. Jamal felt his heart clench with helplessness. "Please, leave him alone," he begged, his voice breaking on the verge of sobs. "He hasn't done anything to you," but these words only caused another wave of gloating laughter. "Didn't do anything?" the thin man asked, leaning closer. "Are you sure? Maybe he's hiding something. Like, where did you even get that thing? Did you steal it?" "I didn't steal it." Jamal felt tears start to run down his cheeks. He tried to hold them back, but the emotions overwhelmed him. "This is my cat. He helps me. He's my family." "Family?" The tall one threw a look of contempt at him. "Are you serious? Family are people, not flea-bitten animals. Maybe that's the way it is in the ghetto, though. Look how he's sticking up for his family member," the skinny one smirked. "Maybe we should see how strong this family bond is." With those words, the tall one tossed Milo up sharply and caught him by the paws. The cat meowed pitifully, and Jamal screamed, "Stop it! Leave him alone!" The policeman ignored his shout. He slowly led the cat away, as if considering what to do next. "You know, I think that beast is sticking his nose in too many places," he said, looking directly at Jamal. "Maybe we should show him where he belongs." "Look at him shaking," the thin man added, pointing at Jamal. "I think we've found his weak spot." "Please don't," Jamal shouted again, his voice shaking with desperation. But instead of answering, the tall man took a step toward the nearest fountain. The water in it splashed calmly in the morning sun, creating a strange contrast to the grim brutality of what was happening. "No, don't do it." Jamal struggled to get out of the broken wheelchair, but it wouldn't move. His hands slid helplessly over the armrests. "Do you want him back?" the tall one asked, stopping at the fountain. He held the cat so that Jamal could see every movement. "Then get up and get him." Those words were a taunt. The cops knew Jamal couldn't get up. They enjoyed his helplessness. "You can't do that, can you?" the skinny one continued, shoving his hands in his pockets. Because you're as useless as your wheelchair." "It's just an animal," the tall one said, lifting the cat above the water. "Let's see how long it lasts." "No," cried Jamal. "I beg you, don't." But the tall policeman only smirked and pulled the cat lower. Milo meowed again, his paws twitching in the air. "That's enough," the thin man said with a sneer. "Come on, just finish it." And with those words, the cat was plunged into the water. Jamal screamed. The scream was full of terror, pain, and anger. He tried to escape from his trap, but the broken wheelchair gave him no chance. The policeman watched his reaction with cold detachment. It was just another game to them. "I think he'll learn not to be rude to the police," the tall one said, pulling a wet and shivering Milo out of the water. But that was just the first step. They weren't done with Jamal yet. Milo was shivering, his wet fur clinging to his body. The cat meowed weakly, trying to cling to the policeman's hand with its paws. The tall one stood at the edge of the small lake in the park, mockingly swinging the animal before Jamal's eyes as if it were a toy. "Watch closely, boy," he said, grinning. "Now we'll show you how fast men like him can swim." "Please, no. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't." Jamal's voice was desperate. He knew words were useless, but he couldn't stop begging. "All we want?" The skinny policeman, standing a little to the side, snorted. "What can you give us? You're worthless. Not you, and not that ugly cat of yours." Jamal lurched forward, trying desperately to reach out his hands to Milo, but the stroller was broken and wouldn't move. Its front wheel was sticking out at an odd angle, as if mocking his efforts. "Look, he's stopped trying," said the skinny one. "Should we help him, or should we just let him sit and watch?" The tall one tossed Milo up sharply, and he meowed pitifully as his body arced through the air. "No!" Jamal shouted, his scream tearing through the morning air. Milo fell into the water with a muffled splash. Small waves spread across the surface of the lake, and the cat, unable to swim, began to flounder randomly, trying to stay afloat. His movements were chaotic. His paws kicked the water with force, but gradually he began to sink. "Look how he's learning," the tall one grinned, pointing at the drowning cat. "Maybe a few more seconds and he'll be a champion." "Save him!" Jamal shouted, his voice already hoarse. "You can't do this. He hasn't done anything to you." "We can't?" grinned the skinny one. "Oh, believe me, we can. And we do." Jamal tried to move again. He frantically reached for the wheels, tried to push off with his legs, which hadn't felt movement for a long time. But it was all in vain. His helplessness, like invisible chains, shackled him to the spot. Milo made a few more faint movements and then disappeared under the water. There were no more sounds or splashes, just the silence that made Jamal's heart feel like it was about to burst. "So, lesson for the future?" the tall man asked, turning to Jamal. "Don't go where you don't belong." The skinny man stepped closer and leaned toward the boy, his face twisted with mockery. "Well, who am I kidding? There's no room for people like you anywhere." Jamal felt the air being torn from his lungs. His eyes filled with tears that he could no longer hold back. These people had just taken away the most precious thing he had. Not just a friend, but a living soul who had always been there for him in the darkest moments of his life. "You monsters," he whispered, breaking down into sobs. You hate me just because of who I am." "Hate?" the tall man asked mockingly, taking a step back. "We're just teaching you how to live in the real world." They stood there for a few seconds, savoring his pain, and then, without another word, turned and walked away. Their silhouettes disappeared among the trees, and Jamal was left alone, condemned to experience this tragedy all alone. He stared at the lake, unable to take his eyes off its calm surface. Somewhere down there at the bottom was his Milo, his family, his one true friend. The world around him went on with its life, but for Jamal, this day was the end of everything he knew and believed in. When Milo's body disappeared beneath the smooth surface of the lake, the world around Jamal seemed to freeze. Only his own sobs broke the silence in which it had been wrapped. The silence, however, was deceptive. There were people among the trees, in the alleys, at the benches. They saw everything. An elderly couple walking their dog stopped a few meters from the lake. The woman whispered quietly to her companion, her face expressing terror, but she didn't move. The man frowned, clutching the dog's leash tighter, but didn't even make an attempt to come closer. On the opposite side stood a young mother with a stroller. She covered her child's eyes as if she was afraid that this little person might realize what was happening. Her lips tightened, and she looked around hesitantly, but her feet remained glued to the ground. Somewhere off to the side, a group of teenagers pulled out their cell phones. One of them slowly raised his camera, pointing it at the stage. "Take it off," the other whispered, nudging him with his elbow. "Let everyone see what they're like." "Are you stupid?" the third whispered sharply, snatching the phone out of his hands. "They'll nail us too if they see us." "And if we do nothing?" The first one threw, but there was no confidence in his voice. "Better nothing than to go to jail for resisting." The third one cut him off and hid the phone in his pocket. Jamal, crying in his broken wheelchair, was like a beacon sending out a distress signal, but no one dared to notice his lot. His gaze wandered through the crowd of passers-by, begging for someone to step up, to intervene, to do something, but no one moved. "Help!" His voice shook, but people continued to avert their eyes. One man in a suit who was walking by turned sharply in the other direction, pretending not to notice anything at all. The young couple on the bench quickly got up and walked away, throwing each other nervous glances. But there were those who watched. Their gazes were filled with a mixture of shame, fear, and a kind of morbid interest. They couldn't take their eyes off the tragedy playing out before them, but none of them dared to approach. "What can I do?" whispered the woman in sunglasses, turning to her friend. "It's the police. You've heard what they do to people who interfere." Her friend nodded silently, clutching her phone in her hand. One man, old and thin, slowly came closer. His face was mottled with wrinkles, and his eyes read years of pain and weariness. He stopped a few feet away from Jamal and the police, but even his quiet voice shook when he spoke. "Leave him alone. He's just a kid." The policemen turned around. Their cold stares, like gunshots, pinned the old man in place. "What did you say?" the skinny man asked threateningly. "I just—" The old man lowered his head. His shoulders slumped, and he took a step back. "I'm sorry, it's nothing." "Get out of here before you get in that baby carriage yourself," the tall man said, and the old man, lowering his head, walked quickly away. A few minutes passed before the police officers left, leaving Jamal in a broken wheelchair by the lake. The crowd gradually dispersed, as if no one had seen anything. But the silence around them didn't mean people had forgotten. Someone made a video. Someone told a story. Someone walked away feeling guilty for their passivity. But no one approached Jamal to offer help, even when it was over. This silent collusion made the pain of loss even worse. Not only did he lose a friend, but he saw how a world full of people could watch a child suffer without doing anything. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, and whether something similar has happened in your life or in the lives of your loved ones. It's important for us to know your thoughts and experiences. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. And now we continue. When the last footsteps of the policeman dissolved into the silence of the park, Jamal was alone. His wheelchair creaked as if to emphasize its helpless state, and one of the wheels spun slowly, a reminder of the recent abuse. The lake in front of him looked calm, serene. It held the silence that had become Milo's grave. "Nice," Jamal whispered, breaking down into sobs. His voice fell silent, swallowed up by the surrounding emptiness. The teenager's hands shook as he tried to propel the stroller. The front wheel was useless. It dangled at an odd angle, like a broken fender. He rested his hands on the armrests, hoping to find some leverage to move it, but his body refused to obey. For a moment he stopped. Helplessness shackled him. The whole world seemed to shrink to the size of this quiet corner of the park, with only him, his broken wheelchair, and the oppressive emptiness. Tears ran down his cheeks, but he didn't wipe them away. There was too much pain building up inside. Every breath echoed in his chest, as if someone were squeezing his heart with icy fingers. Jamal looked around the park. The people who had been standing around watching had disappeared. Not a single face, not a single voice, not a single sign that anyone had been here. Only the birds sang their carefree songs, their trills contrasting with the gravity of his loss. "Why?" he whispered, looking at the water. "Why didn't anyone help? Why did everyone just stare?" These questions remained unanswered. They dissolved in the silence like tears in water. He tried again to set the wheelchair in motion. This time he exerted more force, his arms straining, his muscles protesting, but the wheelchair moved a few centimeters. Another effort, and the front wheel broke, forcing his body to lean forward. No, not that. Jamal moved quickly back to his original position, but the movement only emphasized how helpless he was. A girl in sports clothes ran past. She hesitated for a second, looking at Jamal, but then quickened her step and disappeared around the corner of the alley. It was another blow, more proof that the world was ready to watch, but not ready to act. A minute passed, then 2. Jamal continued to sit, trying not to look at the water, but his gaze kept returning to its calm surface. Where Milo had fought desperately for life, it was now nothing but smoothness. "I'm sorry, Milo," he whispered, clutching the armrest so tight his fingers turned white. "There was nothing I could do." At that moment, he felt the loneliness come over him. It wasn't a simple lack of people around. It was something more, deeper. He was alone in a world that had turned its back on him, that chose not to interfere, lest he become a victim himself. Jamal closed his eyes. For a moment he wished he could just disappear, dissolve into the silence. But instead he took a deep breath and opened them again. He looked at his stroller, at its broken wheel, and realized that help wasn't coming to him. No one was going to come up and ask if he was okay. No one is going to offer to fix his stroller or drive him home. He was alone. Jamal gathered his remaining strength and put his hands on the wheels and began to move. Every centimeter was hard, but he didn't stop. He knew that if he gave up now, he would never be able to forgive himself. As he passed by the alley, he noticed several people sitting on benches. They cast furtive glances in his direction, but immediately looked away as soon as their gazes met. That was what hurt the most: their indifference, their fear. When Jamal finally made it out of the park, the sun was beginning to sink below the horizon. The streets were colder, but there was nothing but emptiness in Jamal's heart. He stopped at the side of the road, looked back, and looked at the park. "This world is broken, and so am I," he whispered before continuing on his way. Silence reigned around him again, a silence filled with pain and questions that no one ever seemed to be able to answer. The next morning began as quietly as the previous evening had ended. Jamal sat at the window of his room, staring out at the indifferent world beyond the glass. The broken stroller stood in the corner as a reminder of what had happened. He didn't know how he was going to get on with his life now. His cry for help seemed to go unheard, but he was wrong. At the same time, in another part of the city, something that was going to change everything was beginning to unfold on phone and computer screens. One of those very same videos, made by teenagers in a park, appeared on the internet. The caption was short and ruthless. 2 cops humiliate disabled black teenager and drown his cat. The video lasted just under 5 minutes, but it was long enough. The faces of the police officers, their sneering smirks, their sneers, were clearly visible on the screen. Jamal's voice was heard, full of despair, his scream as Milo disappeared under the water. The camera shook a little, but it didn't miss a single detail. Every second of that video was a blatant testament to injustice. The video was first noticed by several people. One social media user, known for his fight for human rights, reposted it with an angry comment. Then another. A couple of hours later, it went viral. A storm broke out on the platforms. "How is this possible in the 21st century?" some wrote. "Where is justice?" echoed others. "This is not just cruelty. It is systemic racism and violence," argued others. The video quickly reached the news. Reporters started asking questions. Who were the police officers? Why didn't anyone intervene? Where is the teenager now? Calls for immediate action emerged. At Jamal's house, the phone was ringing off the hook. He didn't know what had happened until his aunt, with whom he lived, entered the room with a stunned look. "Jamal," she said, holding the phone in her hand, "your video. Everyone can see it." "My video?" he wondered, turning his head. Someone filmed what happened in the park. Now everyone's talking about it. She turned on her phone screen and showed him the video. Jamal couldn't watch it all the way through. It took him a few seconds to feel the pain he'd experienced again. "They saw how I couldn't do anything," he whispered, covering his face with his hands. "No, Jamal," his aunt replied, kneeling down beside him. "They see that you have been victimized, and they demand justice." By the evening of the same day, a crowd had gathered outside the police station. People held placards with inscriptions: "Justice for Jamal," "Zrania, stop police violence," "Racism is not part of our system." Among the protesters were journalists, activists, and simply concerned citizens. The site supervisor tried to maintain control. He made a brief statement claiming that an internal investigation had been launched, but the words sounded hollow, and the crowd refused to disperse. At that time, journalists were trying to find Jamal. His house was besieged by cameras and microphones. "Jamal, how do you feel? Do you want those responsible to be punished? Do you think it would help to change the system?" It was hard for him. Every word reminded him of what he had experienced, but he realized that he could not keep silent. "I didn't want it to become like this," he said in an interview, his voice shaking. "I just wanted them to leave me and Milo alone." His words spread throughout the city. They sounded sincere and painful, making people think about how deep the problem is. Meanwhile, the faces of the police officers from the video have become known. Their names, ranks, and past complaints against them appeared in the news. The public began to demand their immediate dismissal and prosecution. "These people should not represent the law," said one activist. "They are not just bad cops. They are a symbol of a rotten system that must be changed." A few days later, a rally was held in the city's central square. Hundreds of people gathered to express support for Jamal and demand reforms. Among them were well-known figures, politicians, and ordinary citizens who felt that this event had become personal for everyone. "Today, we see more than just the tragedy of one man," said one speaker. "We see a mirror of our society, and that mirror is cracked." The crowd met his words with applause. It was still hard for Jamal. He had lost Milo, the friend who had been there for him when the whole world turned away. But he was beginning to realize that his pain was the catalyst for something bigger. His story was no longer just his. It became the voice of everyone who had ever suffered injustice. The trial began a few weeks after the video of the incident went viral. The hall was packed. Reporters, activists, representatives of human rights organizations, and ordinary citizens came to see how justice should be served. However, it was clear from the very beginning, the system was not going to give up so easily. In the dock sat two policemen, the perpetrators of the tragedy. Their faces showed not remorse, but annoyance. It seemed that they were angry not because of what they had done, but because they had been caught. "It's just a misunderstanding," said one of them, tall and sullen, with a mocking tone, as if he was sure that his words should close all questions. "We were just doing our job. This boy seemed suspicious to us." His partner, skinny with an icy stare, only shrugged. "If someone felt humiliated," he added, as if he were talking about some small thing, "that wasn't our intention. We never meant for it to go that far." These words sparked anger in the audience. People started shouting accusations. "Where's your remorse? You killed a cat and humiliated a child. Is this just a job? You don't even apologize." The judge tapped his gavel, calling for order, but the tension in the room was building. The public had expected these men to admit their guilt, but instead they acted as if it were just a work-related incident. Defendants' counsel focused on attempts to discredit Jamal. His disability, skin color, and even his financial situation were used to cast doubt on his testimony. "My client could not have predicted that the boy would react so emotionally," the lawyer said with deliberate calmness. "Yes, the words may have been harsh, but that's not a crime." Jamal sat in the hall listening to those words, his fists clenched with impotence. How could they try to put the blame on him? His attorney stood up in response to these statements. "Harsh words," he said, looking around the room. "We see a video of a child in a wheelchair being humiliated, his only friend, a cat, being drowned, and we call that harsh words? That's not just abuse. It's an abuse of power. It's racism, and it's a crime." The words drew loud applause in the audience, despite the judge's protests. Meanwhile, public pressure continued. The protests in the streets did not subside. People demanded real changes. Slogans were heard on every corner. "Justice for Jamal." "Zrania, stop police violence." "Zrania, no to racism in the law." The media covered every detail of the trial. Jamal's story became a symbol of systemic injustice. Every report showed the video, reminding viewers again and again of those terrible moments. However, the confrontation was unequal. The system protected its own. At one point, a representative of the police department appeared in the courtroom. He sided with the defendants. "These officers are respected employees," he said. "We should not judge them for an isolated incident, especially when their actions were not intended to cause harm." The hall exploded with anger again. People shouted that this was not the first case, that the system was covering its own and the victims were left with nothing. Jamal was sitting in his seat at this time, trying to contain his emotions. He could feel the eyes of hundreds of people on him. They were waiting for him to say something, for some sign. Finally, he stood up. "For them, it's just a case," he began, his voice shaky but firm. "But to me, it's my life. They took away my friend. They took away my belief in what the police are supposed to protect." He shifted his gaze to the defendants. "You didn't even apologize," he continued. "You looked at me and all you saw was my disability, my skin color. You didn't see a person, but someone to be manipulated." His words caused silence in the hall. Even the defendants averted their eyes for a moment. "But I'm a human being," he finished, looking straight into the judge's eyes, "and I deserve justice." When the case came to a close, public pressure became too great to ignore. However, the verdict disappointed many. The police officers were found guilty of abuse of power, but the punishment was symbolic: suspension and a fine. People in the audience jumped to their feet, shouting their outrage. "This is not justice. The system's covering for them again. We will not stop." That day was a turning point. The public continued to protest. Jamal became a symbol of the struggle for justice, and his story inspired others to come forward with their stories of police violence. The trial did not provide the answers everyone expected, but it lit a fire that could not be extinguished. Jamal realized that even if the system tried to resist, the truth would still find its way out. The sunlight was shining softly through the curtains, illuminating Jamal's room. He sat by the window, looking out at the street, where children were playing ball without a care in the world. The broken wheelchair still stood in the corner, like a monument to his powerlessness that day. The new chair that had been sent after the incident was publicized stood nearby, but he hesitated to sit in it. The chair seemed alien, as if it did not belong to his life, but was part of someone else's sympathy, unable to heal his wounds. Several months have passed since the day the court delivered its verdict. Despite massive public pressure, the punishment for the police officers turned out to be a mere formality. They expressed no remorse, and their suspension became a temporary inconvenience rather than justice. This result was the final blow for Jamal. Protests could still be seen on the street. Placards reading "Justice for Jamal" and "No Racism in the Law" did not disappear from the squares. People came to his home to show support, bringing gifts, flowers, sometimes even new animals, hoping it would help heal his pain. But nothing could bring Milo back. Nothing could bring back Jamal's belief that there is a place for justice in this world. He felt empty. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw not a teenager who wanted to live, but the same boy from the park, humiliated, helpless, broken. His face became a reflection of the system that decided he didn't deserve protection. His aunt, the only person close to him, tried to support him. She cooked his favorite foods, brought him books, put on music he loved. But Jamal became silent. His days passed in silence. He rarely left the house, and if he did, it was only late at night, when he was sure no one would see him. "You have to come back to life, Jamal," his aunt said one day, sitting down beside him. "I know it's hard, but you can't let them win." He looked at her faintly. "They've already won," he replied quietly. Sometimes Jamal heard on the news that his name continued to be heard in the community. His story has become a symbol. It was used in speeches by politicians, activists, and even journalists to draw attention to racism and police violence. But that attention only made his pain worse. For others, it was a story, but for him, it was a broken life. He tried to find comfort in the fact that his voice had become important. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the thought that this voice came at the cost of losing something he would never have again. One night, as the city fell into silence, Jamal ventured out of the house. He rolled his new stroller slowly, feeling the cold air touch his face. He reached the park, the very place where the nightmare had happened. Everything was quiet. The lake, where he had lost Milo, was as calm as it had been that day. He stopped at the edge of the water, staring at its surface, his heart clenched with pain. "Nice," he whispered. "You were the best of us. You never hurt anyone. Why did this happen to you?" Tears rolled down his cheeks, and he didn't try to hold them back. The next morning, passers-by saw that someone had left flowers by the shore of the lake. White roses floated on the surface of the water. No one knew who had left them, but they became a symbol of a life that would never return. Jamal's story was a lesson for society. People continued to fight for change, for reform, for a world where such tragedies would not be repeated. But for Jamal himself, this lesson came at too high a price. His trust in people, in the system, even in the world was lost. Is it ever possible to eradicate hatred and cruelty? He wrote in his diary before closing it and putting it back on the shelf. He didn't know the answer, and probably no one did. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? We really need to know your thoughts and hear your stories. We appreciate each of you and are grateful for your support. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and put a like if this story touched you. We wish you a good day and justice in everything.